Okay, well, I get to speak on Dorothy Sayers as part of this series that we're doing. And I'm especially excited about Sayers because while we're doing integration stuff and how theology informs literature, I think you'll see that Sayers kind of runs that current a little bit backwards. She really comes in as a wordsmith and a literary person who then decides to actually do some theology. So as opposed to kind of taking theology over into literature and integrating that way, she actually decides, as we'll see later, theology is too important to be left to the theologians, and you actually need some lay people to get involved, and especially lay people who know about and love language. So this is Dorothy Sayers. She's a little bit of a chameleon visually over the course of her life. If you look at pictures of her from young to old, she seems to change regularly. So I'm struck by how different the pictures of her are. I went back to this slide and put the L in there because I was skimming over one of the biographies, and it said she hated the last name Sayers. She didn't like any of the people in her family who had that name except for her father. She disliked all of her father's family, but she loved her mom's family. So her middle name is Lee, and she actually got personally offended if you called her Dorothy Sayers in print and left out the L. So don't want to offend her, or don't want her angry ghost to come after me. So I went back and put L in everywhere I could. I just realized I have a manuscript and I don't have it with me.
Off the cuff, wing it.
Off the cuff. There it is. Okay, Dorothy Sayers wrote a lot of books. Here's a big stack of them. Lots and lots of writing from Dorothy Sayers. I don't know if you can make out the names and things on there, but most of what you're seeing here is a set of things she wrote, which are mystery novels, murder mysteries. And I really enjoyed these glossy, glamorous, tacky covers from her successful career as a paperback murder mystery novelist. These seem to me just singularly unedifying and not highbrow, you know? I mean, this is, I think when she wrote her first murder mystery novel, she wrote home to her parents. She says, so I'm writing this really good story. It's about this old rich lady found dead in her bathtub wearing nothing but pince nez. So, wonder why she had her special glasses on in the tub, naked, dead. So she wrote a murder mystery about that. Lots and lots of murder mysteries, and this was what she was famous as. She is the author of these books, and they're pretty good. Her main character is Peter Wimsey, who's kind of an upper class awesome guy. As the books roll along, turns out there's nothing he can't do. He's an incredible athlete, a great dancer, a multi-talented linguist and scholar, and people actually start complaining after a while, like, he's a little too perfect, isn't he? And she said, no, I mean, there must be such men somewhere. Dorothy Sayers never married, and somewhere I just ran across this line where she said, oh, if I could have found a man to match up with me and keep up with me, we would have lit the world on fire. Right, so she had not lucky in love, unhappy series of romantic entanglements, and she did eventually marry, but it was weird. Okay, she's got a weird romantic life. Anyway, you can say more about that in Q&A if you want. The other thing that Dorothy Sayers did, if we turn from her murder mysteries, for a period of time she worked in London in an advertising company. And so this is the other thing she did. She wrote murder mysteries, and then she did ads. One of her mysteries involves, it's called Murder Must Advertise, and it involves a murder that takes place in an advertising office. And so she's working with her own knowledge of how things work there. These are some of the campaigns she did. They're apparently very famous in England, especially the Mustard Club was something that just everybody talked about. You know, it's this imaginary, made-up club of, oh, have you joined the Mustard Club? It had its own cookbook. It had the whole thing. And so she's the one who came up with that, and in English, in British context, that's a punchline. Like, hey, did you know Sayers is the one who wrote the Mustard Club ads? Ooh, really? She also wrote these Guinness beer advertisements. Guinness is good for you. So I believe one of the books said that she wrote this little ditty. If he can say as you can, Guinness is good for you, how grand to be a toucan. Just think what two can do. She apparently also made up the phrase, my goodness, my Guinness, which That was a big one for a while. You see that on buses. There are little cartoons. Yeah. Again, these are all really good punchlines in a UK context. But even in our context, you can imagine what it would be like for one of your favorite Christian writers to have come up with ads that you sang as a kid or something like that. So that's what she did. And here's a statue of her in one of the towns that she lived in and died in England. There's a cat there with her. I don't know anything about her cat. Nice cat, though. So Dorothy Sayers had this career. She's the kind of person who you have to make this sort of a list about. You can't just say, here lived Dorothy Sayers, Dorothy L. Sayers, author. You have to say novelist, theologian, and Dante scholar. And even to go with 3 things like that, that's more popular now, right? Like on your Facebook bio or your Twitter bio, you might say like, Christ follower, husband, father, left-handed juggler, fire eater. You know, it just kind of goes on like that. But this is someone who actually made important contributions in lots of areas. And so you have to say at least novelist, theologian, and Dante scholar. You could say more. She did some feminist writing. She wrote a little essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, which I think has kind of gone on and spawned an educational movement of certain kinds. She just put her hands to lots of things. Probably, I think she would want to be most remembered for her work on Dante. Pretty significant scholarly achievement of translating and commenting on Dante's Divine Comedy. We used to read Sayers' translation of the Divine Comedy in Torrey. We stopped because her presence there interpretively is just too much. And we kind of liked that, like, hey, our students are going to read Dante, and they're sort of reading a whole book by Dorothy Sayers as they read the Dante. But we found that was a little too confusing, and she was so persuasive that students couldn't get out of being locked into the Sayers interpretation of Dante. So we decided we wanted a translator who was less present in the minds of the readers, and Dorothy Sayers wasn't good about not being present in the things she did. So her translation's good, especially for readability, you know, to really kind of go along and get the story. But her interpretation is really in your face. That was intentional on her part. She decided you could either just translate it and let people make what they will of it, or you could actually explain to them what's going on. And she had that teacher's instinct to make things radically clear. What I mainly want to talk about, though, is her theological essays. I'll say some more about some of her longer theological stuff, but what I really like about Dorothy Sayers is her brief theological essays. She could write these short little pieces. She was very good at economy of words. Probably that came from things like having to keep an audience interested in a murder mystery, you know, keep the pages turning, and even more economy of words, advertisements, right? My goodness, my Guinness. That's 4 words to sell your beer. And she was good at that. So in her theological essays, she can really get a lot done in a few pages. Some of the best are Creed or Chaos, with a question mark. The greatest drama ever staged is the official creed of Christendom. How's that for a title? It's not a short essay. Most of it's in the title. And it's not a long essay. I mean, most of the argument is right there in the title where she asserts, here's what I'm saying. And let me just pick these apart really quickly. Creed or Chaos is kind of the option she offered the modern world, and especially the English-speaking world, the Church of England public of the UK, where she said, you can either accept and understand and affirm the traditional historic creed of Christendom, or you've got chaos. And so I'll quote some from that essay a little bit later. But then what we'll really come back to is the greatest drama ever staged is the official creed of Christendom. She also wrote a lot of plays, and so one of the things you'd want to put on her plaque is playwright, both for dramas that were staged and for radio dramas that she wrote later on. And her assertion is that you don't have to take the gospel, you don't have to take the Christian message or the creeds and figure out clever ways to make them dramatic. She said, no, if you just take the content of the core claims of what Christianity is, that's dramatic in itself. It's not waiting for you to come along and figure out ways to bring it to life or make it interesting. It already is not just pretty dramatic, but as she says kind of bombastically here, the greatest drama ever staged. The official creed of Christendom. She wrote The Triumph of Easter, a great little short piece about the meaning of the resurrection of Christ. She wrote one called Strong Meat, which is about Christianity as religion for grown-ups, right? No, it's not milk for babies, it's strong meat for the full-grown. A Vote of Thanks to Cyrus, odd one that I'll come back to here in a minute. And then my favorite, The Dogma is the Drama, which has, as you can tell, the same basic argument as the greatest drama ever staged is the official creed of Christendom. How good are these theological essays? They were translated into German by Karl Barth. That's kind of remarkable. Karl Barth wrote, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of pages of his own theology. He wasn't what you'd call anybody's literary agent or translator. He was busy cranking out something like 10 publishable pages a day for his whole life. So I don't know where he found time to say, you know what I want to translate? Some short theological essays by an English crime novelist who turned her hand to some doctrine towards him. He didn't do that with anybody else. The only popular theological writer that Barth ever undertook to translate was Dorothy Sayers. They were so good they were translated by Karl Barth. Barth's not just anybody in theology. He's a big, I'm on the cover of Time magazine kind of famous theologian. When he made his one American tour, Barth said, "My English is criminal," and it was pretty hard to understand through his thick accent. "My English is criminal because I learned it by reading detective stories." He actually had learned English from reading murder mystery novels, including those of Dorothy Sayers. So for him then to come around later in his life and translate some of her theological essays was kind of a neat thing. They struck up a brief correspondence sparked by Barth wanting to know what in the world she meant by a couple of phrases in her essays that were kind of idiomatically English, even British, and he was saying, well, what exactly does that mean, and does this sound like a good translation? She wrote back in nice flowing German and said, you'll have to excuse me, I can't really express myself well in German, so let me use English, and then she switched to English, but nice little footnote there. Okay, I want to look at quickly this essay she wrote, A Vote of Thanks for Cyrus. So there's Cyrus, the Persian, say more about him in a second, and there's Dorothy Sayers. They're looking at each other. She's Cyrus the Great and Sayers the Great. In this little essay, A Vote of Thanks to Cyrus, Sayers says, I owe a certain debt to Cyrus the Persian. I made his acquaintance fairly early, for he lived between the pages of a children's magazine in a series entitled Tales from Herodotus, or something of that kind. Sayers says, he belonged quite definitely to classical times. Did he not overcome Croesus, the rich king of whom Solon had said, call no man happy until he is dead? The story of Cyrus was half fairy tale. His mother dreamed, the oracle spoke. But the story of Cyrus is half history too. He commanded his soldiers to divert the course of the Euphrates so that they might march into Babylon along the riverbed. If you don't know any Cyrus, I mean, he really is one of these amazing, like, whoa, well, can't get into Babylon. I know, we'll divert the course of the Euphrates and just march in. Really remarkable stuff. That sounded like actual practical warfare, though it's amazing. Cyrus was pigeonholed in my mind, Sayers says, with the Greeks and the Romans. That's where Cyrus is. So for a long time, he remained there. And then one day I realized, with a shock as of sacrilege, that on that famous expedition he had marched clean out of Herodotus and slap into the Bible. That's one of the best uses of slap I've ever seen in a sentence, right? I'm not even sure it's correct, but it really works, right? Clean out of Herodotus and slap into the Bible. Now, people don't talk a lot about Cyrus these days because it's the fate of really big world leaders to make history and then fade into it. But it's a shame to forget Cyrus the Great, because for centuries he was the glue that stuck biblical history and wider world history together. He did that by being a major figure in both histories. He's a great figure in the later books of the Old Testament, especially Isaiah, where he's actually called God's Messiah, in Daniel, and in 2 Chronicles. A quick run-through of the mentions of Cyrus in the Old Testament makes for a pretty fascinating Bible study. And you should do that sometime. It's fun to just look up Cyrus and see how this interesting non-Jewish figure figures so prominently in the later books of the Old Testament. But he's also a major figure, as Sayers points out, in Greco-Roman literature. Herodotus narrates his conquests. Xenophon tells you all about how to get an education that will let you grow up to be like Cyrus. This is a really popular book in the ancient world called, no joke, it's called Cyropedia. Yeah, the education of Cyrus, like how you can grow up and conquer the world if you're educated like Cyrus was. He was God's anointed one more than 500 years before the coming of Christ. He took a giant leap forward in international religious liberty with this policy of letting conquered peoples worship their own gods instead of forcing them to worship his. And like I said, he diverted the Euphrates and marched right into Babylon in a datable time, like 17 October 539 BC. And this is part of the magic for Sayers, right? That happened on October 17. We could have Cyrus Day every year if we wanted to. It's actual real history. Sayers talks about how Cyrus's exploits were written on the wall of Belshazzar's palace by the finger of God in the presence of Daniel the prophet. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, right? When the hand of God, when the finger of God wrote a message in front of the king, he was writing about Cyrus. He didn't name him by name, but this is what was going on. So Sayers says, but Daniel and Belshazzar did not live in the classics. They lived at church with Adam and Abraham and Elijah. They were dressed like Bible characters, especially Daniel. And here was God, not Zeus, not Apollo or any of that Olympian crowd, but God bursting into Greek history in a really uncharacteristic way and taking an interest in events and people that seemed altogether outside his province. Sayers says, it was disconcerting. From Cyrus, Sayers' young imagination spread out to Xerxes and saw that the Bible was talking about the same stretch of time that her classics and her ancient history books were about. Sayers says, I think it was chiefly Cyrus and Ahasuerus who prodded me into the belated conviction that history was all one piece and the Bible was part of it. Now, of course, she could have learned this lesson from the story of Jesus, which clearly is situated in Roman history, but she says, yeah, Jesus is a special case. One used a particular tone of voice in speaking of him, and he dressed neither like the Bible nor like the classics. He dressed like Jesus, in a fashion closely imitated down to the halo by his disciples. Now, Sayers is going out of her way to emphasize that she learned these lessons in her youth, when little bits of history were bumping over her childhood mental landscape. But the lesson's not just for children. Sayers says, most children, I suppose, begin by keeping different bits of history in watertight compartments, of which the Bible is the tightest and the most impenetrable. But some people seem never to grow out of this habit, possibly because of never having really met Cyrus or Xerxes. Bible critics in particular appear to be persons of very leisurely mental growth. Kind of a swat at them there. At this point, Sayers can't resist the temptation to spend the remainder of her essay taking a few easy shots at historical biblical critics of her day, kind of fish in a barrel for a well-armed wit like Sayers. She concludes by observing, it's just as well that from time to time Cyrus should march out of Herodotus into the Bible for the synthesis of history and for the confutation of historians. In our own day, the popular mind thinks that the Bible is make-believe, but that's partly because history itself has come to be viewed as kind of make-believe. Sayers grew up thinking about classical history and found biblical history crashing into it through Cyrus. The apologetic task of arguing for the historical reliability of the Bible was already done for her because of her classical education applied to Scripture. All right, so I think that's really characteristic. It's a short essay, but it really sets the tone for what she's going to do. Here's something she says about theologians. Some of them are so clumsy and obscure that one can hardly shake the good ideas out of the mist of enveloping verbiage. This gets to her point that theology is really important, and theologians aren't doing a great job with it. Now, she talks pretty sharply here. I do want to point out, though, that theologians liked her, at least certain ones did. Karl Barth liked her. They had a good time. Their correspondence, Bart said something like, oh yeah, I really recommend these essays by Sayers. I mean, she's British, so of course she's a little bit Pelagian, but what are you going to do? But they hit it off really well. A Trinitarian theologian named Leonard Hodgson, who wrote a really important mid-century book on the doctrine of the Trinity, proposed marriage to her rather insistently. So even though she talked like this about theologians, she said, we've really got to take this out of their hands and get someone who can actually communicate well. But here's what she said about the general public. She said, well, the one problem is the theologians don't know how to write, but the other problem is the general public. What are you going to do with them? 9 people out of 10 in this country are ignorant heathens. I don't so much mind the heathendom, but the ignorance is really alarming. So, let me stick with that for a second. Sayers was a serious amateur theologian who viewed her task as taking the creed and restating it so people could actually hear it and understand it. Now, I'm calling her a theologian, but Dorothy L. Sayers was not a theologian, and she took every opportunity she could to make some version of this public denial. I am not a theologian. So again, just like I'm going to keep calling her Dorothy L. Sayers because she wants me to, I'm going to keep saying she's not a theologian because she insists she's not a theologian. I could put on another hat and say, aren't we all theologians, my friend? Are you being a good theologian or a bad theologian? In that sense, Sayers is a theologian. But I'm speaking for her, and she says, nope, She said something like, playwrights are not evangelists, when she wrote a biblical drama that didn't do all the work that some people hoped it would. In her later life, she drafted a form letter of rejection to send to people who invited her to come speak on theological topics. She got lots of invitations. She called the letter NMR, and she would just tell her secretary, send them the NMR letter, no more religion. Right, just on her personal schedule, just constant theological invitations. Most often, however, the place where she chose to publicly and loudly declare her untheological vocation was in the opening sentences of a theological essay, so you could understand how people would be confused. So how do we talk about the theology of an avowed non-theologian? You have to start by taking her at her word, respecting her wish to be understood as a professional writer, but an amateur theologian. She was a dramatist who served the church as an honest layperson, plying her secular craft, without churchly ordination or doctrinal training. It's precisely here, as a professional in wordsmithing who happens to be an otherwise ordinary Christian, that she rendered her unique service to the church. Sayers set herself the task of stating the Christian faith for the popular mind in words as clear and dramatic as possible. Along the way to her goal, she encountered two main obstacles: the inarticulacy or obscurantism of professional theologians, and the intellectual laziness of the average uninformed layperson. I guess we can go back to those. Those are the two quotes. The fact that theologians are just lousy communicators is evidence, according to Sayers, that theology has to be taken out of their hands and used by amateurs. Let me see. She asks, why is such a bulk of Christian teaching and preaching conducted in terms so vague that the audience can't even detect that claims are being made, that ideas are being proposed, and that these ideas could either be true or false, meaningful or irrelevant? Are these theologians so clumsy with words that they are unable to communicate, wondered Sayers, or are they deliberately trying to hide their meaning? This is the Sayers who wrote the book, the essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, fighting hard for better writing, clearer speaking, and more competent communication from believers. But even if every working theologian were suddenly granted the gift of eloquence, the second problem of the general public would still stand in the way of communication. The average person has an apparently boundless ignorance of Christianity, rooted in their laziness and thoughtlessness. After she said she didn't really mind the heathendom so much as the ignorance, when a broadcaster asked her to write a short letter explaining Christianity to the average person, she said back to the broadcaster, "The only letter I ever want to address to average people is one that says this: I do not care whether you believe in Christianity or not, but I do resent your being so ignorant, lazy, and unintelligent. Why don't you take the trouble to find out what Christianity is and what it isn't? Why, when you can stir yourself up to mug up a few technical terms about electricity, won't you do that much for theology before you begin arguing about it? You'd be ashamed to know as little about internal combustion as you do about the Nicene Creed." There you go. Now, I kind of keep that in my back pocket. It's like, I'd like to say that sometimes, but I won't, because it would seem mean if I said it. And I also point out that Sayers herself didn't say it, right? She said to a broadcaster, "This is what I'd like to say." So she had a sharp tongue, but not that sharp. Sayers was unsparing in her criticism of modern people who let themselves fall into such abysmal ignorance of Christian doctrine. A woman wrote to her to ask for some clarification about her essay, The Greatest Drama Ever Staged, and Sayers replied in writing pretty brusquely, "I think you would find things easier if you were to read a little theology. If I may say so, you give me the impression of never having been grounded properly in the subject. I get the impression that you acquired a sort of child's eye view of Christian doctrine in your early youth, and you've never done any stiff reading on the subject. So you're now judging with an adult mind doctrines which have only been presented to you in very simplified form." She actually did write that to the Inquirer, and I think, ooh, that's pastorally helpful and also very incisive, right? Like, yeah, you talk like someone who's using your adult mind to judge kindergarten Christianity. You should read something, anything. Sayers expressed herself with this directness because she was convinced that Christianity had a magnetic power of attraction if only it were stated clearly. She believed she could apply her skill as a writer to stating the gospel with relentless clarity. Her repeated protest that she was no theologian was exactly right. Sayers was actually an advertiser. She had worked for several years as a copywriter, and by her own admission, it was this job that had taught her how to get the message out as directly as possible. My goodness, my Guinness. Wasting no words and stating the main point right up front before you lost your audience. When she turned her skills to Christian faith, she recognized that what Christianity needed most was not to be redesigned, tweaked, updated, defended. What Christianity needed most was to be sold. And Sayers devoted her skills to getting the main ideas of Christianity into the public mind by any means necessary. She didn't often argue in defense of the faith in traditional apologetics. Instead, she developed an apologetic of simple presentation. If people simply see and understand what the church has been claiming all these years, they'll be drawn to it. The dogma doesn't need to be made exciting. There's no way to add any drama to it from the outside. And that brings us to The Dogma is the Drama. It's my favorite essay by Sayers. Sayers says, if the average man, quote unquote, is going to be interested in Christ at all, it's the dogma that will provide the interest. The trouble is that in 9 cases out of 10, he's never been offered the dogma. What he's been offered is a set of technical theological terms which nobody has taken the trouble to translate into language relevant to ordinary life. Now, to illustrate this, the fact that when you're telling people about Christianity, and I keep wanting to use words like presenting the gospel or witnessing or something like that, and those aren't Sayers' words. She's going to talk about the creed and the dogma and the church with a capital C. She's Anglo-Catholic, national Christianity in England. To make this point, she wrote this little short examination paper on the Christian faith. This is in her essay, this is in the essay, The Dogma is the Drama, where she kind of puts out catechetical questions and sees what she thinks the average, uninformed layperson would say in response to them. What does the church think of God the Father? Answer, He is omnipotent and holy. He created the world and imposed on man conditions impossible of fulfillment. He is very angry if these are not carried out. He sometimes interferes by means of arbitrary judgments and miracles, distributed with a good deal of favoritism. He is always ready to pound on anybody who trips up over a difficulty in the law or is having a bit of fun. He's rather like a dictator, only larger and more arbitrary. Now, let me pause here because this is going to go on for a little bit. It's pretty obviously blasphemy. And what Sayers is trying to do here is say, this kind of blasphemy is actually occupying the minds of people these days who think they are informed about Christianity. Now, you can rail on them all you want and say it's their own fault for having opinions about things they've never even tried to study. You can curse the church for it and say that the theologians and the pastors are incompetent and they've given this impression. There's plenty of blame to go all around. She's just really diagnosing and saying, this is the state of affairs. If you stop the average person on the street and ask them what they believe, or ask them, notice it's not what they believe, what does the church believe? What is the official creedal teaching of Christianity? Okay, this is a little Trinitarian section. Well, what does the church think of God the Son? He is in some way to be identified with Jesus of Nazareth. It's not his fault that the world was made like this. And unlike God the Father, he is friendly to man and did his best to reconcile man and God. See atonement. He has a good deal of influence with God, and if you want anything done, it's best to apply to him. Well, what does the church think about God the Holy Ghost? I don't know exactly. He was never seen or heard of till Pentecost. There's a sin against him which damns you forever, but nobody knows what it is. What is the doctrine of the Trinity? The Father incomprehensible, the Son incomprehensible, and the whole thing incomprehensible. It's something put in by theologians to make it more difficult. It's got nothing to do with daily life or ethics. What is meant by atonement? Well, God wanted to damn everybody, but his vindictive sadism was sated by the crucifixion of his own son, who was quite innocent, and therefore a particularly attractive victim. He now only damns people who don't follow Christ or who never heard of him. What does the church think of sex? God made it necessary to the machinery of the world and tolerates it, provided the parties A, are married, and B, get no pleasure out of it. What does the church call sin? Answer, sex. Otherwise than as accepted above. She wrote one essay called the Other Six Deadly Sins, with the assumption being that in the popular mind there was only one deadly sin, it was sex. Right? But we could also talk about these other six. Getting drunk, saying damn, murder, cruelty to dumb animals, not going to church, most kinds of amusement. Original sin means anything that we enjoy doing is wrong. What is faith? Resolutely shutting your eyes to scientific fact. What is the human intellect? A barrier to faith. What are the 7 Christian virtues? Respectability, childishness, mental timidity, dullness, sentimentality, censoriousness, and depression of spirits. Wilt thou be baptized into this faith? No fear. All right, that's pretty grim stuff, but notice Sayers is actually going out there to clarify, and she just doesn't have that rosy disposition that's always going to stay on the sunny side of things, right? She's got some serious cutting work to do to sort of lay bare what the problem is. In that essay, Sayers says, it's startling to discover how many people there are who heartily dislike and despise Christianity without having the faintest notion what it is. If you tell them, they cannot believe you. I don't mean they can't believe the doctrine. That would be understandable enough since it takes some believing. I mean they simply cannot believe that anything so interesting, so exciting, and so dramatic can be the orthodox creed of the church. Now, Sayers wrote a thing called, a radio drama called The Man Born to be King. I have an odd relationship to this book in that it's widely hailed as her masterpiece. She viewed it as a great accomplishment, and it has some fans. I can't stay awake long enough to read it, so it puts me in an odd position of saying, she wants to make it dramatic and exciting, and I just have to say, I keep trying to read this book, and I can't. I don't think that's a judgment on the book. I'm actually thinking, so there's something wrong with me here that I haven't penetrated this book at all to figure out what's going on. I think I might need to hear it on the radio or something. I think maybe I shouldn't make myself sit and read it, but if I could hear a broadcast of it, I'd be able to get into it. It was controversial for a couple reasons. Sayers actually very cleverly used marketing to stir up some controversy to publicize the radio drama. So she had the characters of the life of Jesus talking like normal people talk and saying some kind of attention-getting things. And she just went ahead and let the conservative religious press go nuts with this about like, oh, terrible, she's just soiling Jesus and the Gospels. And she kind of intentionally let that run in order to get more people to listen to it. So kind of fun to see Christians playing that side of the game, which is not what we normally see these days. So when she wrote this radio drama, she said, it had a lot of success, and she said, when people would interview me about it, all these things were looked upon as astonishing and revolutionary novelties, imported into the faith by the feverish imagination of a playwright. I protested in vain against this flattering tribute to my powers of invention, referring my inquirers to the creeds, to the Gospels, and to the offices of the church. I insisted that if my play was dramatic, it was so, not in spite of the dogma, but because of it, that in short, the dogma was the drama. The explanation was, however, not well received. It was felt that if there was anything attractive in Christian philosophy, I must have put it there myself. Now, I think this is kind of a common problem for good communicators who really are trying to expound what is there in the Christian faith. Even if you think about how to compliment a preacher or a teacher sort of on your way out, and you say something like, wow, that was great, you really brought it to life. Right? Now, it's a fine thing to say, and everyone knows what you mean by it, like that was engaging to listen to, but think about what it implies. You know that dead, lifeless Bible? Somehow you came in with awesome magic powers of communication and infused life into it. I am so impressed with the sheer brilliance and life force that you have, that you can press into dead, worthless doctrine. That is awesome. There should be more people like you, like making the Bible actually do things. Now, of course, we don't mean that when we tell someone, wow, you really brought that passage to life. But Sayers is watching very carefully the words and saying, don't compliment me for making the Gospels dramatic. They are dramatic. Now, she's a craftsperson, so she knows she did a lot of careful work choosing words exactly right to bring things out. But she insisted on pushing the drama and the excitement and the attractiveness of Christianity back to the creeds, back to the Gospels themselves. Here's sort of a manifesto from her that I think we can apply to our own work. Sayers says, let us in heaven's name drag out the divine drama from under the dreadful accumulation of slipshod thinking and trashy sentiment heaped upon it, and set it on an open stage to startle the world into some sort of vigorous reaction. It is the dogma that is the drama. Show that to the heathen, and they may not believe it, but at least they may realize that here is something that a man might be glad to believe. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.